So this is the project. It's actually a pediment above a doorway, but it's a Queen Anne bonnet top style scroll board and gooseneck molding. Some people call it swan neck molding. Okay, so I bandsawed away the first piece here. I tried to stay right on the outside of my line. I didn't do a double line this time. I went really slow, really slow, so I didn't cross over the line. And I was lucky I went into the line a few times. There's a lot of rough cuts here that are going to need to be sanded out. But my advice would be go really slow, maybe tune up your bandsaw before you start, which I did not do, but I have done recently. You know, in the end I went a lot of back and forth. It was kind of like maybe a drunk blind squirrel bandsawing probably, but didn't seem to cross over the line, just into it, so I'll sand it down, make it smooth, and take it from there. I kind of wish that the first time before I even routed this, that I'd put the template on top of the piece and drawn a nice pencil line on the back edge of the template, so I wouldn't have to use the compass to scribe that along there. So I'm not sure that's as accurate. I think if I'd put that template on there, put pencil lines on both the top and bottom, it would have been a better thing to do, so I wouldn't have had to come back and use a compass scribe along here. So yeah, that might be an option before you stick your template on top, to make sure that you've got a pencil line already set back from the edge before you remove all this material. I've been able to sand a lot of the curve with just the rigid. I did get out my drum sander here, but actually the curve on the end here is about the same. Seems to do okay. So it's kind of slow work and just kind of working my curve around. Still got a few kerf marks in the back here, like the one deeper one right there. I can either use a hand scraper or just keep sanding down a little bit, trying to keep it a little bit even along this top edge. I would recommend that you start with a thicker top edge than what you want to end up with when you first cut on the bandsaw, because there is going to be a lot of sanding back. So maybe in retrospect I would have used I did go a little bit thicker. I kind of thought about that ahead of time than the final, but I probably would have liked to have gone even a little bit wider on that top band there. Yeah, this morning I got a little shop cleanup, and now I'm getting ready to kind of straighten out this edge. I think when I flipped the templates, it wasn't quite lined up, and it's a little uneven, and it's got this ridge, and one end seems to run out a little bit on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my square on there and take a piece which I've already checked to make sure this corner is 90 degrees with my square, and I'm going to run it up close to there and just lock it in here and double stick tape it, then use an upcut spiral bit out of the shaper table and go ahead and clean that edge up. Next, to mark my 1/4 inch overhang, or over the top there, I used the bottom edge, this edge here, because I found that was a lot more consistent. My top edge, where it was bandsawed and sanded, wasn't very consistent. So I wanted to get a scribed line about 1/4 inch, so what I did is just take the flat part of the compass and just run it along. Until I got my reveal. I noticed in the tighter parts of the curve it got a little thinner on the width of the stock, and again there's something to do with sanding and bandsawing that had to do with that. So I'm going to make sure that I use that bottom edge, which is much more consistent with the template when I laid it on top of there. Got a little more narrow than I wanted to with all the sanding and that. I mostly used the rigid, but I went back, did a little hand sanding too. It's not the final sanding yet. Next I'm going to work on cutting out the area around the rosettes. I'm still trying to contemplate the movement for the the seasonal wood movement expansion, and how best to do that. I know people normally put a slot screw in the top to allow it to go up and down a little bit and glue the bottom edge, but the problem is the rosette's going to be locked in with screws from behind. So I'm contemplating how much I might have to worry about that. I noticed that Norm actually just base nailed it with a nail gun right through the front of the trim here, right along the bottom, right into it all the way up. So, and I've seen other people glue, and I guess the old timers that made them, they used to nail them too. I don't like to face nail because I don't want to leave the divots and fill it with a wood, so I'm going to take screws from behind and glue it. But whether I should glue it all the way up or leave some kind of movement, I'm still deciding. I'm working on setting up to cut out the semicircle for the rosette. So what I basically did was I held a flat piece along the bottom and then put this over here and kind of lined it up visually on the sides. I thought about using a piece of paper, be even thinner, but I already had this template from before. I just kind of set it up a little bit, again about quarter inch above. Use the bottom edge. So for the Forstner bit cutout, I took the block that I'm going to use for my rosettes and just held it over there and traced it. Hopefully it'll work left and right. Once I cut it out with the Forstner, I'll check it. I think I've changed my mind on how I'm going to draw the cutout for the Forstner bit for the rosette right around here. I went ahead and just clamped it directly and going to draw off the line here. I did make the template here to attach to my piece and then cut it out, but I think this might be a little bit more accurate since my left and right sides are a little bit different there. So I'm just going to trace around with a pencil here and then maybe use this to complete the circle. As I was starting to drill out the area for the rosettes, the board jerked on me, so I added more boards to brace it front and back, put more clamps on. And it's a problem because it's such a big bit and it's a little bit weighted uneven. I did try to put some boards up under the edge there, but it did jerk out on me a little bit, so we'll see what happens when we start again. Hopefully I've got it locked in a little better. I might want to bring a board from the other side too to lock it in. Well, I'm clamping up to cut the rosette out of the gooseneck molding. And I know you're probably thinking, is this a joke, this big clamp here? No, you know what? This is just the little brother. You should see the big brother clamp. It's about 42 inches long. So anyway, I think I might need to put a few more clamps on there. Maybe a half dozen or so, maybe a dozen. We'll see, but I just don't want it to move. Kind of had trouble clamping down on this end here. Nothing really reached to the middle of the table. So I finished cutting the other side. I noticed that on the fit there's a little gap there, and part of that is it's angled. If I back cut that or back sand out the back edge, probably use a drum sander, take the lower edge without hitting the upper edge, I think it's going to line up a little better because when I slid it up a little bit it fit better. So it's pretty close, and again I'm not going to sweat a little gap like that, and I can just back cut a little bit. It might be that the cylinder's slightly small. I kind of sanded it a little bit small, but it's pretty close, and I'm going to have dark stain, and there's going to be a cap on the rosette that actually overhangs a little bit too. That'd be pretty close. It's going to be hard to see, but I am going to take it to the drum sander and try to back cut the bottom edge there, just kind of tilt it up a little bit so I can get that a little bit tighter fit than that. But the nice thing is I didn't have any blowout with the Forstner bit. I was a little worried about this edge blowing out coming through from the other side, but Forstner cut pretty clean. I did support it, put some boards up here. They weren't the exact profile. Well, I needed a transition piece here between the pine cone finial I've got here and between the scroll boards, so I just kind of sketched out a little bit based on dimensions. I had to glue 2 blocks of leftover wood from the gooseneck molding from the ends, glue them together to get a piece this wide. I didn't have anything wide or tall enough in a stick of maple. I've got lots of mahogany, I could do that, but anyway, so I'm going to turn that. In order to do that, I'm going to start with sharpening some of the basic tools. Mostly I use a skew. I've kind of gravitated away from the roughing gouge to round things off, but you can use a skew for the beads. Might use a little spindle gouge, a little cutoff tool. So I'm going to work on sharpening those. Okay, I like to use the Wolverine jig. I put the blade in, tighten up. It's about a 2-inch marker on this piece that comes with it, about 2 inches from the end, tightens it in there. I like to use a little Sharpie marker on the back of mine to get it black, and put it in the holder here and put it on the wheel, put good pressure against it, hand turn it a few times, make sure it takes off a fine line along the edge, which I will do in a minute, and then we'll sharpen it. I'm using a diamond wheel here. This is due for the final sharpening. If you need to rough it out, I use a more coarse wheel. So let's go to it. Not quite there. Pretty close, pretty darn close to getting all the marker off. Almost. That's good. Got all the marker off, so good. I've already taken the heel off previously right here. Let me show you. The heel's already been removed, so I can get in tight areas there. Well, I've got them all sharpened now. I was doing the skew, which is again my favorite turning tool, even though the spindle gouge here is probably the most versatile. Just like they say, the router is the most versatile tool in your workshop. Can do the most things. I think the spindle gouge is probably the most versatile for turning, but I'm sure everybody's got their own opinion. But when I was doing the skew chisel, I was trying to kind of really just put a slight more pressure on the tip, a slight more on the heel, and then trying to find that center point to kind of really get the feel of that tool on that diamond wheel, so I didn't distribute the force too high on the tip or the heel. Trying to rock it a little bit. I could hear a difference in sound. I could feel a little bit difference, and tried to find that center point there. I was trying to become one with the machine, the tool, my hand, and the machine, and I almost did become one because I brushed my knuckle up against the grinding wheel just briefly. Didn't take any skin off though. So no blood, no harm, no foul. Ready to turn. So what I did was I glued 2 blanks, leftover pieces from the gooseneck molding. That was the whitest blanks I had, in order to get this urn transition piece between the pine cone and the scroll board. And I'm rounding it off. It was just 2 square blocks, and I still got a little bit of a flat spot right here, so I need to take it down a little bit smaller, and then I'll measure it, make sure I didn't get too small on my measurements against the little diagram I drew earlier. Using a skew chisel, I just get better feel than I do with the roughing gouge. The U roughing gouge, I think the skew you can feel a little bit better, and the depth of the cut can control, and actually can take a little bigger cut too. So next I'm just taking and marking my layout lines for each portion from the diagram of the length between the two different sections. I've got a little waist on the top there, then I've got my top part of the urn turned down, then the middle part, then the lower part. I'm going to put in a few more guidelines, and then we'll cut them to depth. Well, yesterday morning before work, I glued the rosettes on, and I didn't have it marked at the time. I had the front marked, but I didn't have the back marked, and I actually glued them on the back side. So about 10 minutes into glue up, I thought about knocking them off, but I remember how fragile this area is and didn't want to split up my scroll board, so I'm thinking about just leaving them on and putting another on the front, letting them run out the back. Why couldn't I just use this as a front? Well, I could. It's got some waves in it from where the drum sander didn't do as well on this side. I didn't clean it up quite as well, and it even had a few planer marks at the top edge from the lumber yard that I never got deep enough. I didn't want to go too narrow on it to get rid of, but those would probably be covered by the gooseneck. So I think at this point I'm going to go ahead and turn another rosette and put it on the opposite side and have it extend out, and just leave these on the back, drill through them. I did pre-drill. I pre-drilled 3 holes for the gooseneck molding and 1 for the vertical support in the back, and then countersunk them depending on which direction I'm going. Again, they're all countersunk on the wrong side for this to be the front. So I did forget 1 hole down at the bottom here for my vertical support, the wall behind the scroll board. Again, this is for the gooseneck molding here, here, and here, and countersunk those, but I'll put in another screw here. Why did I put my rosette blocks on so soon? Because I'm going to deviate from the normal way of doing this, and when I cut this corner down here, miter it, I'm going to actually have it attached to my scroll board, because I'm not really building a case. This is a pediment for above a doorway, so I'm just going to have a narrow wall going back along it. So I think I'm going to attach it and just cut it on the miter saw here, rather than making a jig that's shaped very similar. Well, I have finished turning the transition piece for the pinecone finial. Well, not quite finished. I've got to make the plug, the dowel here. I'm going to take a Forstner bit and make the turn it down to about a little bit bigger than this Forstner bit, in case, in the event that the hole is a little bit bigger, it's always easier to sand down this. It's always easier to sand down this piece here. So I'm going to keep it slightly bigger than the Forstner bit I'm going to use eventually to drill the holes, and then I'll remove it here and here once I get it down to width here. I did have a chip out in this area, so I kind of changed my profile from original profile here and put an extra ridge in this area right here, because with the spindle gouge dug in here and took a chip out of there, so I ended up doing a 2-tiered piece, but that's fine. A little extra detail. Always do the sanding while it's still on here. It makes it a lot easier. So it probably needs a little more sanding before I remove it. But right now I'm going to take this down to depth. I got down to the end of trying to size this. I guess I call it a round tendon. I got a little nervous, didn't want to overshoot it. I was using the calipers the whole time, so I actually took a sanding block. I cut a piece of wood to that width there and Then put some sandpaper and then just kind of bring it down a little bit at a time. I guess if you turn a lot, you don't really need to do that. You can bring it right down to the caliper while the caliper's on it. For somebody like me that only turns every few months, at least once I got done with the pin addiction, it only turned every few months. But so I just brought it down with a block and brought it down pretty darn close. I'm leaving a little bit big, like I said, hopefully for the hole, because you can never make the hole smaller, but you can always sand this down and make the tenon smaller. Now I'm just going to remove this end and be done with this transition piece. Well, I've been out of the shop a little while. Took some time to go up to the North Georgia mountains and see the beautiful fall leaves. Back in the shop now. I took took a Forstner bit and drilled it about down to that mark there, and then put some screws all the way through to the front. This is the back of the scroll board. Because I decided to leave this on. Most people are just going to screw through here from behind. Got my pre-drilled again. This is going to be a cross support on the inside of the case. I'm getting ready to do the back scroll boards to meet this curve, to make this whole area here, and cut out the curve. But I need to get some double wide boards. Just pick some old junk lumber. It's never going to see the light of day. And I'm getting ready to use my table saw method of planing instead of using the planer, where I'm going to run it blade right down the seam but lower than the top, so it still holds the two edges together, and that way my blade will be the two sides will meet exactly, even if I'm a little bit off on the angle of the blade. And then I'll do the glue up, so I'll have some double wide boards. But yeah, they're pretty junky boards, but again, they'll never see the light of day, so it doesn't really matter. So in about 10 minutes I did all these mortise tenon joints. By the time you're sharpening your chisels to do them by hand, that's where the Festool really saves you time. I didn't worry about getting them exactly in the middle, and I made them a little wide here. This is just for glue up, to keep alignment at least with one side, and to maybe add a little structural strength too. But these pieces are all going to be for the back of the scroll board, the up and down piece coming back, and the back wall that's going to be shaped like this on the back of the case. I guess I'd call it a case, even though it's really a pedestal. So I was able to do all that in about 10 minutes, just once I got the setup. Of course, the setup took a little longer, getting the blade, switching out a different cutter for that small cutter. And I always like to do it a little wide, because it doesn't really affect the structural strength of the joint by being a little wider. And you can also take a chisel and just shave off the edges and use a more narrow mortise. You just want to make sure that it's tight up and down, this side and this side. This side doesn't really matter for strength. The glue drops were left overnight, just some regular Titebond 3. And I'm going to scrape off the residual glue. I use, for this rough wood where I'm not so worried, I'm not going to use a card scraper. I'm going to use actually a paint scraper. Just kind of get a big box store. It's a little sharp on the corners. Been meaning to round those off on the grinder. But since it's junk wood that'll never be seen, I'm just going to use this to kind of do the initial scrape off of the glue. And then I'm going to run it through the planer again here. So my next step, I'm going to attach, at least temporarily, the gooseneck molding by screwing through the back of the scroll board here at these 3 points. I just did 3 holes on each side. This one was a little too close to the miter where I'm going to cut off, so I had to put another hole next to it. Counter so I could check my screws for depth against it, make sure I'm not going to go through it. And I'm going to use some of these brass screws, I guess. I've seen others use those. So it's going to go pretty far in, but it's going to go pretty far in, but it's going to be okay as far as the width, because I've held it up next to it on the side profile. I started with clamping down on the rosettes, the first part here, to get this piece flushed down. So I clamped underneath to bring this down, and then I applied the rest of the clamps using a previous pencil line that I'd drawn right along here. So next I'm going to go ahead and screw this on, because I'm going to use my scroll board to do the cutoff, because I'm doing mitered corners. I'm not doing any type of dovetailing, not for this pediment above a door frame. If you're doing a bonnet top for a Queen Anne piece of furniture, you're probably going to want to do a whole different joint on the end of this board here than what I'm doing. I'm just mitering it back, maybe apply a domino for the joint, but you'll probably want to do a temporary board to cut it on the miter saw instead of using the scroll board that I'm using. But I am going to put it on and then take it back off, because I'd rather stain up under it in case it moves a little bit. I don't want a line of stain showing, or unstained wood showing. So I'll stain before I apply my gooseneck. I'm getting ready to miter the gooseneck molding, and I just happened to find some pieces hanging on the pegboard that I didn't have from before. I'm thinking it might have been for a crown molding job, but they're nice because they're low profile, because the screws are inset and I go right into my saw. They were already measured out for the 2 holes here and here. You can pop this off. There's a little knob back, slide it off, draw 2 holes. You could just take a pencil through the back and not take it off, and draw 2 holes and screw it. So that'll give me a low profile head once they're pushed all the way in like this, where I can slide the piece in front of it and I can still use this reference edge. That's why I need these, is for a reference edge on where to cut. And it happens to be that they're a little past the line. Whatever angle I was doing, it seems to be slightly different, or maybe they were slid back or something. So this should work out just fine. And again, I just happened to find these hanging on the pegboard this morning. Didn't know I had them. I was contemplating attaching boards other ways. The clamps would be in the way. That's the problem. I could clamp one side, I suppose, and run up under there. So it might be a little tight because it's a little high. So this is a good application for these pieces, and I think it's going to work out quite well. Well, I'm setting up, getting ready to cut the miter joint. Again, most people probably won't be doing this. They'll be making their own kind of throwaway scroll board off a piece of plywood or something, and then just double stick taping the gooseneck to that and kind of running in. Similar to this. One thing I ran into is I've got the line on the wrong side for cutting. This one that's already cut, it should have been from this left piece coming up to here, because I've got the width of the blade to take into account. But I'm just going to estimate it, because this piece sits on top of a doorway frame as a pediment, so I can make the width a little. I've got some leeway on the width. It's not confined to any case underneath it or anything. It's sitting on a shelf actually. I did have to bring up this side to get it flat to reference it off the table. Make sure you reference it off here, because my infeed table is a little bit low here, and that's the way I kind of like it actually. I never want it higher than the actual saw table, so I just shimmed it up on one end until I got it nice and flat in this area. So I'm going to need to cut through. I think I'm going to scoot it back actually and do a sample cut first to see how much tear out I get up under here, and see if that's acceptable. So I cut it. There wasn't too bad on the tear out here. It did burn a lot. Maybe time to get a new blade for the miter saw, I'm starting to think. But I went real slow through it, took my time, made sure I had it clamped good, and I anchored it with my hand, and did have it shimmed so it's flat on the table here, referencing the table. So now I'm going to do the other side. It is nice to be able to do it on the scroll board, have it cut exactly to the length without having to worry to match it up exactly. Okay, so I'm going to put some dominoes in the ends here. So I just marked off real quick from each end in case I get upside, downside mixed up. At least they'll be at equal distance from both ends by using a little sliding T-square here. So I'm going to run the 2 dominoes in here. I made sure I've got plenty extra here. I've actually only need about 8 inches. That's 9 inches with my hand from here to here. In case for some reason if I put the domino all the way through or something, which I can't imagine in this thick of a board, that's going to be a problem. So I'm going to put 2 in each side here just to miter my joint. Not that I really need that much strength, but I think it'll be a little bit extra. That'll be fine. It's easy enough to do. And you can notice I've taken off my gooseneck molding, or swan neck molding, whatever you want to call it, and removed it, and I'm going to put it back on later, and hopefully it lines up exactly how it was before. It should. I've had pre-drilled the holes in it beforehand. One thing I didn't talk about was on these Rosette blocks that I had to kind of glue them first, and then so I clamped and glued, then I ran the screws in. And I did that before on my prior project too. I used the Titebond glue to glue this onto the scroll board. I think my previous project I might have used cyanoacrylate glue to set it in place and then screwed it in place. But I think the Titebond might hold up better against the shear force. Somebody comes along and conks it. This is high enough up, I don't think it's going to be a problem. Anybody coming along and conking it. So you may ask, what the heck does a taper jig have to do with anything? Well, I got a little interrupted in the middle of my work to do something else. Take care of a few household items. I'm about to cut one of the cross panels for the inside of the casing. I guess I'll call it a casing, even though it's really just a pediment with an open bottom. Felt I was going to get my second wind today after wiring an outdoor light and patching up some holes in the dog room, but never did find the second wind. Don't know what happened. Anyway, I think I'll wrap up a few cuts here and then head upstairs for dinner. Well, I've attached this back piece on here. I need a little broader top here. When I did it, I cut it big on a bandsaw, then I screwed and glued it, then I flush trimmed it with the up spiral bit, which did a real smooth job on it, except I tilted the router here a little bit in that one set, but that'll be covered anyway. So I even flush routed the bottom with this scroll board. You could make it higher, nobody's going to see it from behind. I tried a straight board up and down like this behind here, but when you look through you could still see the edges of it and it just didn't look good. So I went ahead and did it to profile, routed it to profile. A little tricky problem when I got up in the corners here, I was hitting that back rosette. I guess if I hadn't put that on there, it wouldn't have been in the way, and most people won't have that problem because they just put a front one on. But yeah, I couldn't get the router past it, so I had to switch to a trim router here, little bitty one, to get around the corners there and get it down to be flush. It needs some sanding and things, and then I'll work on the transition. When looking back at this piece, the toughest routing was actually not the gooseneck routing. That was pretty fixed in. The toughest routing was coming around these pieces, especially when I went against the grain. And that was the hardest to control, even on the shaper table. So that's probably of the scroll board, that this round piece that stick out. I remember earlier in the video you'll see that I chipped off half of it and had to re-glue it there. But anyway, that was the toughest part routing, not the gooseneck. As you would expect, the gooseneck would be tougher, but that was pretty much locked in and pretty easy to do. So I'm going to work on case construction. I did get some canvas to glue to the bonnet top board underneath it. I ordered a 12-ounce untreated artist canvas. Comes in like 7-ounce, 10-ounce, 12-ounce. It might be thicker than that, but 12-ounce looks good enough. Don't waste your time going to linen stores or craft stores. I couldn't find it there. Even ones that had artist canvas, they didn't have untreated or in a roll, so I pretty much had to order it online. It wasn't too bad. Another thing I ran into was my festool domino when I was cutting the miter joint, the mortise tenon, the two of these on each side. I ran into a problem in that the 5mm cutter head broke off in the mortise. It actually, the tip of it was lodged in the bottom of the mortise. Took me a while to figure out why the heck it wasn't cutting right, but looked in there and saw it. I guess that happens. That's the first time it's ever happened on me. I called Festool. They don't really replace the cutter head, so I ordered another one for about 39 bucks. You know, I think most of the time that would be if you plunge too quickly when you're doing the Festool domino. You want to kind of slowly advance it into the mortise, but I don't really think I plunged too quickly. I was going fairly slow. They were fairly shallow. I think probably just wear and tear over time, and the tip just busted off. But at least it lodged in the wood and didn't go flying somewhere. Yeah, I was real surprised that happened. So that was the same day I actually broke a drill bit when I was pre-drilling for the gooseneck molding these holes on and the bit was coming back out. It was starting to pull the board up, and I pushed the board back down, and it broke off one of the brad drill bits, brad point drill bits. So next I'm going to work on some of the blocking and back. I think I'm going to put a piece here so this upright piece can be screwed into that. This piece will be behind the gooseneck molding. It'll come through, and so I'll put a couple blocks there, and then I'll start working on these up and down. Now theoretically, I mean, this grain is running this way and this grain is running this way, so there could be a problem with expansion and contraction. And if I were building this for Queen Anne bonnet top heirloom furniture, I would actually use a piece of the end of the scroll board this wide and do the grain this way, so it would expand and contract together with this piece. I went and just glued this on, glued it on and screwed it in, and then routed it afterwards, just kept it a little bit big. So I think it's going to work out. I've had other pieces that I've had for 10 years in the home and haven't seen much in the way of movement on them. So I guess it depends on how long you've had your wood out too. If you had it stored in the basement for a long time, maybe, and it's dried out and the moisture content's gone, then maybe you'll do better. This is actually newer wood than I usually work with on the scroll board, so we'll see how we do. So a lot of people, this top screw hole would just take and make an elongated screw hole by taking a spiral bit off your Dremel tool and drill initial hole, and then take your spiral bit and bring it down and make it elongated so the wood can move up and down, the screw can move up and down the gooseneck molding, where they would glue it down here at this base of the corner and then allow it to move up here with just 2 holes, one here. Now I'm putting 3 holes in, I'm gluing mine down, and I'm saying, gosh darn it, if Norm can face nail that stuff to it, I think I can get away with this. Especially it's just a pedestal. Again, if it was an heirloom piece, I'm gonna probably go ahead and do that method, elongate my screw hole with the spiral bit on the Dremel and allow it to move up and down with the movement of the grain. Well, just like what would every woodworking video be without a festool domino showing up or some other festool, now I've got a Lee Nielsen plane that has to show up. Basically what happened was when I mitered this joint over here, this lifted up, it didn't line up exactly, so it's a little off the table down at the bottom, and I need to flatten out the top by taking a little more off this end, a little less off this end, so I'm going to bring it down so it's kind of horizontal with the back piece going across, so the bonnet top will come down even on it. So there's going to be a little gap at the bottom. That doesn't really bother me. Again, what you can't see doesn't hurt you in carpentry unless it affects you structurally, so as long as you can't see it, it's fair game, I think, in carpentry. So we're going to take a few pieces off the end here, and it's a pretty thick, that's a pretty thick piece to take off there, but I'll work at it for a little while and bring this end down to my pencil line that I've got angled across here so it'll line up better for the bonnet top eventually. Alright, I'm working on some glue blocks to screw to for the vertical pieces here. So what I did is I glued on a guide here by putting a little packing tape on the back here, and that gives me a guide with a gap where this extra cutoff that I had. I'm going to cut off the bottom portion there. Should be a line on there, about there. I'm only going to make about that tall. I wanted to keep it under where you could visualize from there, although if you'd be looking up, I don't think you'll see that. I'm going to go ahead and pre-drill it first. Well, I've got a long stick here with this cut off before I cut it off, and then I'll glue it and screw it in there, and then that way my vertical piece here can screw down into the bottom of this block as a guide. So it's just an extra guide with a little packing tape so the glue doesn't stick. That's the plan. So for my glue blocks here, I actually put a little shim under it with packing tape so I didn't have to flush trim it like I did this with the router, because this one actually hung down a little too low. So that brazed it up. I had these locked in place just as guides. The screws I used 2.5 inches. They were kind of tough to drive because I didn't pre-drill this board here, so I had to actually soap them up, just to take the bar soap and run the screw and get it nice and loose, and then it would drive easier. The one on the other side, similar. So they've just been glued. There's a little squeeze out I'm going to take care of here. but I used the guides and locked them in. Maybe I should have pre-drilled. It might have made it a little bit easier, because I had to back out the screw and run it in once or twice just to get it tight enough all the way in. In order to mount the finial and the transition pieces, I just drew some lines from the corners to find the middle to run my Forstner bit. And I'm getting ready to do one of the transitional pieces here. And my clamps here wouldn't reach to the deep enough to get this, so I just put some double stick tape on here, turn it upside down, and then clamp it in place with the side clamps here before I drill press the Forstner bit for the middle. I suppose if you couldn't really fit this on your drill press table because your scroll board's taller, wider, whatever, best to just make a wood block and outline it from below with a pencil mark. Make it maybe about, you know, that thick so you can keep the drill bit straight. So mark it off, cut it off, make a separate block on top, drill through the center of that, then attach it to here, and then use that as a guide to get flat on down. That way you could just take it out freestanding and do it wherever you're at. But yeah, make your own block, just pencil up from below, put a wood block on there, and then cut it off to those dimensions, exact the same as the top. Find the center point, drill press it on the drill press with the table raised, then take it over to your piece, and that would work. Mine, because it's a more narrow scroll board than what people are going to make for bonnet top down here, it could fit up there on there, and hopefully it's pretty square. I went ahead and put in some upper glue blocks too. I'm thinking about this screw hole up here coming in from the other side. I'm thinking I'm screwing into end grain, and I'm just not real comfortable with screwing into the end grain, so I put a hole on this side, and while it's still open before the bonnet top goes on there, I'll drill in that side. I probably will put this screw in here too. So this one I just glued and put a little tight bond on there and kept it a little bit band-sauded around the edge there, and then screwed it in there. I've been pretty busy with the pocket hole jig Craig system, trying to show you how many joints I've got for this. Again, this isn't a standard case because I'm not doing a bonnet top. I'm doing a pediment on top of a door frame. So just to get a kind of an idea of all the different joinery I'm using, this pocket hole is going to anchored into the shelf that's already above the door. It's already there. This is for the finial and the transition pieces. These are for the gooseneck. This one has, down at the bottom, it's going into a glue block on the other side, and then this side glue block's coming in from above. There's also a screw right behind that going into the end grain. That'll just help anchor it before I put the other screws in. And on the end here, for the back of my case, I'm using 2 pocket holes on each side to kind of go in this joint here. These are more just for the molding, gooseneck molding from behind. When I built my first gooseneck molding, I remember I had like 13 mortise tenons on each side, and I really didn't want to put any screws in there, but I couldn't figure out how to get the gooseneck molding on. Everything had, you know, wood dowels or mortises, and so when I got down to the end of it, I ended up just going ahead and putting screws in from behind, using some brass screws and bringing in my gooseneck molding. There goes the purist in me that wanted all wood and glue joints. But anyway, it was a difficult glue up because I had 13 mortise tenons on each side and had to do 26 of those all at once and hope they all fit and all clamp together, which they did. So on this one, again, there's a lot of different joinery. There's pocket hole screws on the outside going to this backboard, and glue blocks everywhere, and I might even put in a few more glue blocks before I'm done. What I haven't figured out yet is how to anchor these sides down to the shelf, because on the outside any pocket hole would show, on the inside it'll be covered with the bonnet top. I might end up having to drill straight through, all the way through the bonnet top through here. Yeah, again, that wouldn't be seen because it's sitting on top of a door frame and you're kind of angling up. And some of these other pocket hole screws on the back are going to go into the shelf here. I kind of spaced them for right between here where I can bring a bit in order to anchor it to the shelf below it. So it's basically just showing you there's a lot of joinery here. I mean, you've got pieces here, you've got pieces coming from the outside here, from the inside here, you've got pieces coming here. Again, I'm not a big fan of going into end grain for screws, so those are just kind of help anchor it there until it's in place with the glue blocks. Glue blocks can always be added later too. I think a lot of people that do bonnet tops, they add a lot of glue blocks to kind of anchor things, and that can always be done if you're screwing into end grain. I think you can always later add some glue blocks and put them in the corners there to strengthen the board. Again, this is not really that strong of a structural piece. It's not going to have a lot of weight on top of it, so you know, it doesn't have to be the strongest in the world, which is why I'm not doing a lot of mortise, tin, and festool stuff, although I am going to join the top pieces here to this bottom board along here. I'm going to use festool dominoes for that and build that piece in. It's just mainly to keep it in alignment. I mean, I could use pocket hole screws, but in the past, the pocket hole screws, I've always noticed sometimes they twist a little bit on you and you get out of alignment no matter how much you clamp it. So I'm going to use the dominoes and reference off the inside edge to keep these in line. So I cut some domino tenons, and one thing I'm being very careful of is advancing the cutter head very slowly so I don't break off the cutter again like I broke the previous one. Again, I'm not sure if I really advanced it that fast, but anyway, I advanced very slowly through these. Already joined this piece together, had good alignment marks here, left it a little bit wider so I can move it back and forth here. It's kind of it's pretty tight in there already, but here's the joints. So it worked out pretty well. Just took my time, went through it, had the vacuum hooked up to make sure to suck out the chips. Well, I'm getting ready to cut off the top of this vertical piece. It's part of the inside of the casing. Left a little note up there just so I didn't forget. Drew a little line right along here. Just took a little pencil line both sides. Took the shorter of the two ends, and then take it over to the table saw here and set up. Used an angle gauge to kind of get the angle and of the blade there, and I've got it marked on both ends actually. I don't know if you can see that right there. So I'm just going to slice off. I'm not going to get right on the line. I'm going to stay outside of it, and then I'll either rasp it or sand it or do whatever I need to bring it down to the curve, or plane it. That's right, hand plane it. So I'm getting ready to run that through the table saw right now. So the next step was to be able to join these two pieces together and to find the center. So basically I used a center finder to mark this piece, and then punched out, took a little awl and punched out a little nib in there so the Forstner bit tip can fit in there and find the center. The other side it already had a center. This was store-bought, and wherever it was turned it left a center on there, but I just double checked it. That's why the lines are on there. And so in order, this piece I can't really do on the drill press. No good way to hold it exactly perpendicular to the hole. So what I did is I took and made a piece to fit on the bottom here. Took a Forstner bit right here and then cut a hole, and I just bandsawed this off, kind of sketched it around the bottom of this piece here, and then bandsawed it off, and then sanded it down to pretty close, and then drilled a hole through the center. That'll keep my Forstner bit kind of perpendicular to the flat surface here to drill the hole perpendicular, and then I'm going to just insert this piece of dowel rod. I happen to find one that just the Forstner bit fit just right. So that's the plan, just to use a kind of a cutoff I found in the trash can and use that to keep it perpendicular, since I can't do it on the drill press directly because there's no good way to clamp this pine cone upside down. Well, you know, it didn't quite work out as well as I thought. I double stick taped the reference piece to the piece here, and there just wasn't enough length on this Forstner bit to stay square when it went through the block there. So it was a little bit off, but it actually is going to work out. When you look at it, it's not quite square coming out of there. The peg I put in there, I held it up, and it's a little bit off, but you know, when I put it in the finial into the holder there, it actually, and look at it from a distance, it's actually it's good enough. It's not really tilted. I don't see a big gap on any edge of it or anything. It seems to fit down pretty flat. Might be a little play in there. Yeah, feels pretty tight. So anyway, it worked out. Again, probably if it was a bigger bit and maybe used a bigger dowel, it might have referenced a little better off the sides of my guide block here. But it worked out. So I actually double stick taped that, and then I clamped it upside down in a clamp here and to drill it, got it started, and then I took the clamp off and took it over the drill press, actually, because I noticed it was a little off square, and tried to line it up a little more square. So it turned out okay, and it's going to hold together. A lot of people leave these loose. They never actually glue them together on their pieces, and I guess maybe because they ever need to replace it or something. I'm not quite sure why they don't glue it in place, but so you can remove it. But a lot of the older pieces that were made a couple hundred years ago, they actually, never totally glue them in there. They're just kind of loose. My piece I've got upstairs with 3 finials in it, they are loose too. They can be pulled out at any time and redone if I guess I need to, or there's some kind of problem, break off or something. This one's pretty solid. I can't see this breaking off. I guess I could just glue it. We'll see. So I wanted to kind of put a little glue line down here, a little groove along the bottom so the glue doesn't drip off the edge. And I drew a little pencil line first, and I decided, I was trying to think of what kind of tool I would use for this. You could use a Dremel. There's probably multiple things you could cut a little groove with. I have some electric burrs that I could put on a electric carving instrument, but I just got out a little U-gouge. Looks like a real small one. It's almost a V-gouge. And it seems to work quite well. It peels right up the first time here. It just puts it straight up here. You see a little curly Q there. Little pig's tail right there. So it took that right up there. Made it real easy to do. I'm not going to go too deep. You just don't want to go over the edge with that. But seems to work pretty well. Yeah, good morning. Today is a sanding day, and for the next 30 minutes I will show you as I go through the various grits of sandpaper, not skipping more than 100 between the different grits. Just kidding, I'm not going to go that long. I just want to talk very briefly about this grain pattern. Down in this curve it's kind of long grain, then you go up and you get kind of end grain here. So I always know end grain is going to soak up a lot more stain. Also, you're going to have end grain here. Whoops, sorry, I can't show that very well. End grain here. So what I've been doing is differential sanding. Again, I don't have any formal training in anything really, not in certainly anything to do with finishing, but I'm just kind of trying to figure it out. And so what I did is I sanded my surface down to 220. That's about where I stop on everything. But in these curves, I've gone up to 600 on this portion, about 400 on this portion. Maybe it was 350 or 320 in this area. So I differentially sanded it, which I've not been doing in past projects, but I'm always worried this end grain is going to soak up a lot more and get too dark. There's other portions of this that's going to have end grain too that I'll have to differential. So I'm going to try, before I've just done the entire surface in one grit and gone a lot higher on end grain. And that's worked out, but again, you got to really almost polish it to keep it from soaking up too much on this end grain. So I'm doing differential sanding, a higher grit here, a lower grit on the long grain, then a higher grit again on the end grain there. Just my 2 cents. We'll see how it turns out. Again, it's going to be looking up from below on this piece, so it's, to even see that curve, you just see the top edge probably up under it. Won't see much of that inside of the curve there, since it'll be sitting on top of a doorway frame. Now if you're doing a Queen Anne highboy bonnet top, then boy, then you're going to really spend a lot more time sanding than what I'm going to spend doing this. I did, why did I put some stain on the back? Well, you know, you always hear this thing about dimensional stability or whatever. I think David Marks was big into that, about painting both sides of everything so it didn't warp or whatever. I did some of that on the back side. I'm not sure if I believe all that. I think it might give a little bit of resistance to moisture absorption in the future, maybe. I don't know. It seals it. This is a pretty lousy stain. It's a poly mix, a poly stain mix. It's got polyurethane and stain together. It's really hard to deal with. Wouldn't recommend it myself, but I'm trying to match some bookcases, which match the fireplace, which match this pediment. So it's a very dark stain too, so it can make this lighter, cheaper wood look nice. I wouldn't put it on mahogany or anything like that. I would probably, you know, I just use Danish oil for mahogany with polyurethane top coats. But for this maple, you know, it'll give it a darker wood appearance. So I'm about finished with the staining process. Pretty much I use oil-based polyurethanes top coat after I put the original stain on, and I sand with 400 grit between the layers of the polyurethane after I get one or two on there. I think I put about 4 on here now. Didn't do all the surfaces, like didn't do as many on the vertical surfaces. They're a little bit tougher. As far as the staining, you know, I try to do it before I assembled the pieces. It's a little easier when it's not vertical where it's going to drip. Certainly any vertical surface, even the back side, I would go over and over and over with dry brush or near dry brush toward the end to make sure I don't have any drips. I found the end grain on this these curved gooseneck moldings. There's some end grain pieces that got pretty dark right in this area here and here that I should have sanded more than the 220 that I went to. Should have gone down a lot higher grit on that. I'm filling in the pores and smoothing it out over multiple layers, but I'm still going to have that dark stain there. I guess if you're using lighter stain, you don't have to worry. Again, in here there's some end grain. I didn't sand enough, so next time I'll do that more. I like to use a very bright light to kind of get the cross rake to kind of get down low, and got another light positioned up here in addition to my fluorescent lights. It just lets me see for any areas I missed or imperfections, but you really got to get down low and kind of look at it sideways when you're staining. As far as cleaning up the oil based, I use just a simple method of, you know, multiple jars of odorless mineral spirits, and start with the most dirty jar, and then they get cleaner as they go, and just, you know, put the brush in each one and progressively get to the one that has the least amount of sediment in it. And then I take soap and water to it, brush cleaner, like wire brush cleaner to it. I'm getting ready to make the bonnet top section, and I bought a stack of these thin pieces of maple at Woodcraft. I think it was for $39.99 for a stack of them. I think they're supposed to be used to laminate to make skateboards, is what they mentioned at the store, but they're pretty thin, and I'm going to go ahead and yeah, it does say skateboard on there, doesn't it? I'm going to take and put some contact cement on there and put my material on the backside to keep it from splitting. I guess that's the rationale for that. I guess you could use flexible plywood too. I don't know, there's supposedly rubber based stuff in there. I don't know if that would hold up quite as well long term. Maybe it would.